Thank you.
Senator Fawcett.
Well, thank you, Mr Deputy President. I also rise to contribute to this bill. I'd just like to start by affirming the position that I have put in this chamber before, that I don't support same-sex marriage and I won't be supporting this bill. That doesn't, however, make me a homophobe, nor does it mean that I speak with hate when I state my position. And I respect Senator Sims for his view and for his support for this bill. The fact that I choose to disagree with him doesn't make me hateful, and it doesn't make me homophobic. I would just like to go to some of the issues that were contained in Senator Sims' speech, because I think it's important that we do keep a broad perspective on what is happening around the world. We have been accused of lagging behind, and a number of countries, Ireland and the US in particular, were quoted. But there are also other countries, such as Austria, where their parliament recently voted overwhelmingly against motions for same-sex marriage. Other nations around the world, Italy and France, where we've seen large public protests around those laws. Probably most specifically, though, in July last year, in the European Court of Human Rights, sitting as the Grand Chamber, dealing with a case that goes to their Convention on Human Rights, they found that there is no consensus in Europe on allowing same-sex marriage. In the case which was being considered, they found that there was no violation of the European Convention on Human Rights, finding that the court found it was not disproportionate that a same-sex couple should be in a registered partnership as opposed to a marriage. And in fact, regarding Article 8, the court reiterates its case law, which said that the Convention cannot be interpreted as imposing an obligation on contracting states to grant same-sex couples access to marriage. They also said in Article 12 that it secures the fundamental right of a man and woman to marry and found a family. Article 12 expressly provides for the regulation of marriage by national law, and it enshrines the traditional concept of marriage as being between a man and a woman. Now, according to the statements by Senator Sims and by others in this debate that say that anyone who opposes same-sex marriage is full of hate and homophobic, then the European Court of Human Rights is homophobic and is issuing hate speech. But what it demonstrates is that you can have a debate around these issues, you can have a respectful difference of opinion, and any attempt to shut down opponents of a view is simply undemocratic. Australia is proud, as is much of the Western world, of the fact that we are a liberal, small l liberal, plural, secular democracy. Now, plural means that you have a plurality of views. You have people who are free to speak of different views, and that doesn't mean that those who you oppose in terms of the views that you hate or that you disrespect them as a person. It means you have different views, and that is the basis of a plural society. And so Senator Sims in his speech said that this movement will not be silenced. Well, that's fine. I'm happy. That's their right to not be silenced. But likewise, it is the right of those who hold a different view to not be silenced. And so I find it disturbing when I see attempts to silence those who hold a different view. Now, that attempt occurs in different ways. Partly it's through labelling, calling people bigots, making it an assumption that if you don't support same-sex marriage that you are homophobic or that you are full of hate, right through to using legal proceedings. And I notice that the Catholic Church, and I'm not a Catholic, but I noticed the Catholic Church issuing a booklet which supported the traditional view of marriage, sending that to families who had enrolled their children in a Catholic school, have now been taken, or action from a discrimination perspective has been taken against the Church for putting forward their view of the traditional marriage, which is law which is accepted, and yet they are now being taken, legal proceedings being taken against them. Now, that is trying to silence people who hold a different view. And in a plural society where we value freedom of speech, and in this case freedom of religion, then we need to allow people to clearly articulate, respectfully, courteously, but confidently, their view, and to have labels put upon them that somehow they're bigots or homophobic or their speech is hate speech just because they express a different point of view is trying to silence the debate. Now, from the Coalition's perspective, we had a good example of how that debate, respectfully, can be conducted. We have people within the Coalition who have differing views. We have very strong proponents of same-sex marriage. We have people who hold dearly to support for traditional marriage. And we had a long and respectful discussion in our party room where people from each side of that debate were able to stand and talk and put their point of view. And I don't normally talk in public about things that occur in the party room, but in this case I'll make an exception to say that there was no name-calling, there was no hate, there was no belittling, there was no disrespecting. People put forward their view, and that is the essence of a democratic society where we respect the fact that it's a plural society, which means there are groups with different views. A plebiscite was where the party room came to. We decided at the end of the day that it would be best for the Australian people, given the deeply held views, to have that discussion. Now, there's an assumption implicit in what Senator Sims and others have been saying in the last few days, in fact since the plebiscite was announced, that the Australian community would descend into an orgy of hate and homophobic speech. Now, I acknowledge that there are some people out there who hold what I would consider to be unhelpful and hateful views. I've seen some of those people with placards, and Senator Sims, can I say, I share your view. I don't think that's helpful or respectful. However, that doesn't represent the majority of Australians. And the thing that I see in Australia is that we are a land of people who are decent, where there is common sense, and it is my experience that those extremes tend to be suppressed and shouted down by the majority. And you've just got to look in recent days at some of the things around sporting fans and name-calling and other things where we see the community moderate those extremes. And so there is a discussion and people can have their view, put forward their point of view. Now, at the end of the day, while Senator Sims says that we've had poll after poll, if we just accepted polls, then we'd never have elections. We would assume, based on today's poll, that the Coalition should be in government, Labor should stay in opposition, and the Greens should always stay to be a minor party. So if we're going to take that logic, let's save some money and have no more elections. Let's just have news polls and let's not move forward. But what we see is that sometimes polling doesn't get it right, and that's why we have elections. Because the polls are an indication of a small group of people who've been rung by a pollster. They respond to a particular question that is put to them. And even on this issue of same-sex marriage, depending on the question you ask, you can get different results. So I don't accept the argument that just because polling indicates one thing, that we should therefore assume that's the will of the Australian people. And so a plebiscite gives an opportunity for the Australian people to have the discussion, to reach their own view. One of the things that we can decide as a parliament is how that plebiscite should be run. Whether it's binding or not, whether everyone should participate or not. And they're important things that we get right, because if we look at the Irish referendum, because it's not compulsory there, the number of people who turned out didn't represent the whole population, and so whilst there was a majority of those who turned out, you can't say that a majority of the Irish people supported it. Now, does that make it invalid? Well, it depends how you determine a referendum. But here in Australia we have the opportunity to say that the plebiscite should be compulsory and that it should be binding. And I think that's what we should do. The challenge I would put to the Greens and to others who support the concept of same-sex marriage is, if we have a plebiscite and it's binding and it says yes, then you would need to work with those who don't support same-sex marriage to put in appropriate protections for freedom of speech, freedom of religion, for the expression of those things. But equally, if the plebiscite said no, the challenge for the Greens and others would be to accept that and say, well, that's what the Australian people have said. And so you can't have your cake and eat it too. If you want it binding in expectation that it will say yes, you've also got to accept that if it says no, then that's the will of the Australian people. Because I note that here in the Senate we have had motion after bill after motion put forward, and time after time either it hasn't come to a vote, or where it has, it's been defeated, and yet they keep coming back. And so if there is a plebiscite and it says no, I would encourage those supporters to recognise that, just like the European Court of Human Rights have said that it's not an abuse of human rights, that there is an equality in terms of what people get through a civil partnership, that is the path that we should explore and make sure people can be respected and valued within that. So certainly from the Coalition's perspective, we have seen that we don't believe we're lagging behind. We believe that you can have a respectful discussion. Nobody in this debate should be silenced. And that a plebiscite is a way where we can allow the Australian people to answer the question about how they would like to proceed, how they would like to see marriage in this country. Currently, the Marriage Act here provides that ministers of religion, whether they belong to a recognised denomination or an independent religious body, are not obliged to solemnise any marriage. We need to make sure that those sort of independent decisions can continue, not only for people in religious organisations, but even for people of faith who run other business or services. Whilst it is true that a plebiscite, if conducted separately, would cost money, there are options to do it in conjunction with other votes, with other elections, but this is an issue that is clearly important to people in this place and to people in the community, and the concept of having a plebiscite is one where we give to the people the opportunity to exercise that democratic right to have the discussion in a respectful way and to bring back to the Australian people through a vote which way they would like to see this nation go. So, in conclusion, Mr Deputy President, I won't be supporting this bill. This is one of a number of bills that I have not supported on this topic. I'm a strong supporter of traditional marriage. That does not mean in any way that I'm homophobic or that I speak with hate. In fact, I deeply respect many people I know, many whom I regard as friends, who are same-sex attracted, but my worldview is that marriage is between a man and a woman. And on behalf of all of those in Australia who hold that view, I state here again in this place that just like the supporters of same-sex marriage don't want to be silenced, nor do those people who hold this view. And this parliament should be rejecting any sense or motion or discussion that those who hold a different view to the supporters of same-sex marriage are somehow full of hate or bigotry, because that is simply not true. I won't be supporting this bill.